Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another podcast with me, Matt Houlihan. And this is part 2 of a 2-part on British comedy influences for me. Previous podcast, I spoke about the early 20th century of British comedy and the influences from music hall and the innocent but cheeky hidden humour of British entertainment which had to contend with the censors. This episode, it's the late 20th century. My personal influences growing up from the very early years, from the earliest memories of 80s TV comedy all the way through to now. So I hope you enjoy the ride. Blackadder really influenced me. Blackadder was written by Richard Curtis, Rowan Atkinson, Ben Elton, starred Rowan Atkinson, Tony Robinson, Tim McInerney, Miranda Richardson, the brilliant actress, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. And Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie wrote a bit of Fry and Laurie and developed their own humour, which I still laugh at. It was a history tour with the most absurd, silly, witty, dark elements of storytelling and character. It really caught me. Rowan Atkinson, I think, was and is a clown of a very high calibre. Mr. Bean was something else. I'd say most people of my generation were hugely influenced by Mr. Bean, Blackadder, The Young Ones.
Still, since I'm here, I may as well do it, as the Bishop said to the netball team.
Rick Mayall and Adrian Edmondson went on from The Young Ones, which was literal anarchy in a television format, to creating Bottom, where they played the most disgusting, lonely, sad, comic, clown-like, slapstickly violent double act. Their live shows and their TV shows were just so funny and absurd and stupid and uniquely British. It was a particular gift to grow up as a child in the early 90s. The comedy influences of that decade were particularly strong, I think. One Foot in the Grave, starring Richard Wilson and Annette Crosby, is something that I could never imagine being performed or appreciated properly in any country other than the UK. If you haven't seen One Foot in the Grave, take the time out to watch it. It's some of the best writing I've ever seen. It's Richard Wilson playing a grumpy elderly man living out his retirement with his long-suffering wife. Their misunderstandings, their mistakes, their errors, the honesty of the writing, the incidents, the characters and the people that we meet along the way brings comedy to an art form. It brings comedy to a level of truth-telling and honouring of elderly people in particular, which I don't think many other countries can replicate. It doesn't have to be a happy ending. It just has to be an honest ending, an authentic ending, a poignant ending.
I do not believe in the name of sanity.
Dame Edna Everage has been a character performed by Barry Humphries, an Australian comedian who's been in the UK for a long time, for decades. She's a sort of more music hall type performance comedian, but she has had her own television show, The Dame Edna Experience, and she has appeared regularly over the decades in talk shows and chat shows, being outrageous, funny, alluding to lots of things but not quite saying them. The epitome of traditional British subversive humour. Very funny, very patronising to the other guests, very condescending, full of backhanded compliments and veiled insults and outrageous hilarity. Long may Barry Humphries continue to do so. I would also give a big shout out to Eurotrash. It's not strictly a comedy, but it was hosted by two French people, Antoine Decaune and Jean-Paul Gaultier, the designer. And it gave an international perspective for the British, for Europe, for the similarities and the differences between the British and various European countries, in that very British way of lovingly mocking our neighbouring European countries and cultures and strange eccentricities. The idea of the lovable eccentric is something that Eurotrash really encapsulated, which is so British, but they combined it with a fierce sexuality which really exploded in the 90s, and for a young teenager to witness that was a real joy. Particularly the interviews with European eccentrics and their stories dubbed over with northern comic actors' voices was just something else. The joys of our diversity, the common eccentricities and sexualities.
Penis.
Paul, you can say penis on British TV.
What can you say, penis? On
You just can't.
Sorry, the English has no more penis?
The Fast Show, which starred Paul Whitehouse, Charlie Higson, Arabella Weir, John Thompson, Carolina Hearn, the wonderful Carolina Hearn, of Mrs. Merton and Malcolm, and The Mrs. Merton Show. She was a particularly funny woman, and her writing was so beautiful and touching. She also wrote for and starred in The Royal Family, about a typical working class British family who just live life and the absurdities of those experiences, the hilarity and the poignancy of those experiences. Carolina Hearn came from a working class Irish background, and like Steve Coogan and many of that generation of comedians and creatives, they really championed a working class perspective to British humour, which traditionally had been held by Oxford and Cambridge graduates. So it was a huge deal. The Fast Show was so rapid-paced, so many silly characters, so many gags and iconic, ridiculous, exaggerated characterizations that it became such a huge popular show. I've seen a YouTube video of Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer, Shooting Stars and The Smell of Reeves and Mortimer and things like that, particularly northern British humour, being shown to an American audience. The American audience, they didn't get it, but they thought they got it. They thought that it was just stupid. And I think this is what marks out British humour from humour across the world, and certainly in North America. There is an intelligence to British humour, there is an insight to British humour, but there's also a willingness to laugh at oneself. There's also a willingness to accept that stories don't have to make sense or have happy endings. This is what I think makes British humour so popular, because it's so honest and so authentically ugly.
What are you doing there?
Hey, don't you worry, it's a love potion.
All right.
The girls will be attracted to you from miles around.
All right.
Oh no, I've just sprayed him with the ladies' potion that attracts men. Doesn't he look gorgeous? Look at those lips.
Vic and Bob really brought a manic, creative, absurd, hilarious, devil-may-care kind of attitude to comedy that it was a blessing to be a young child and a teenager in the 90s. The next big, massive, vast sea change in British humour, which carries on the tradition of absurdity, tongue-in-cheek, observant and articulate writing, but adds to it a sense of fly-on-the-wall incisiveness and reflection on British culture, the hypocrisies of the British media, is The Day-to-Day. Chris Morris. The Day-to-Day began on BBC Two. Chris Morris and Armando Iannucci developed a spoof news project called On the Hour in 1991 on BBC Radio 4. They worked alongside such famous names now as Steve Coogan, Stuart Lee, Richard Herring, Rebecca Front. Their careers developed into creating, in 1994, a BBC Two series called The Day-to-Day. It's where we first see Alan Partridge, developed by Steve Coogan, and so much of it is about the difference between entertainment and reality, how absurd reality can be, particularly in the world of television, news, public perception. And that's where so many spoofs and parodies came in terms of Chris Morris's work. And It then developed into Brasseye, which was the full realisation of, I suppose, Chris Morris's reflection of the British media and politics and culture. He also created Blue Jam for BBC Radio 1 in the late 90s. And the Brasseye specials, I remember being so shocking and influential that people still talk about them. The rise of mockumentary satire, of deep satire, like The Day-to-Day, Brasseye, Jam, the writing of people like Armando Iannucci and Chris Morris, of course, skewered popular culture and put a lens over the absurdity of particularly the British media, was a joy to behold, to really take it all apart and deflate some of the pomposity and the bullshit that popular culture upheld. Armando Iannucci and Steve Coogan went on to develop Alan Partridge, which is a vast influence on British culture, in my opinion, particularly on my growing up. I think everybody can do the impression, everybody can do an accent, memorise and repeat lines from the series. Alan Partridge is a former light entertainment TV host and news presenter who is so English, repressed, right-wing, so ignorant, self-centred that he doesn't see the effect he has on other people. He says things which are honest and which are accurate in many cases, but it's like the honesty of a child. You don't expect him to say it. He's nauseating with it, but that's where the humour comes from. And you feel for him as he tries to keep his TV career going. Clive Anderson's talk show in the 90s was similarly outrageous. He has a very sharp wit and can be quite cutting to his guests, famously having a falling out with the Bee Gees live on his show at one point because they didn't like his veiled insults. But if you've got a sense of humour, you will appreciate it. And I remember being influenced by him in the 90s. And of course, he hosted Whose Line Is It Anyway? In the UK for a very long time with Ryan Stiles, Colin Mockery, Josie Lawrence, a host of very funny improvisers. And the whole show was the height of improvisational skill in various games of situations that performers would be thrown into. It was a wealth of joy for a young, inquiring mind in the 90s to watch that programme and to get a sense of the breadth of so many genres and styles and ideas and references and comic situations and farce and stupidness and funniness that can be had with an audience. It opened my eyes. I heartily recommend you look it up.
So it just remains me to thank Stephen Frost, Caroline Quentin, Colin Mockery, Ryan Stiles, Richard Runcipan and me, Clive Ellison, saying good night. Good night.
Now comes something particularly close to my heart, Father Ted, written by Graham Linehan, who went on to write The It Crowd. Father Ted appealed to me particularly because it spoke to my experience as someone from an Irish Catholic family and culture. It perfectly captured so much of the stupidity and parochialism of priestly Catholicism and culture, of the small town mentality of people in cut-off places, misplaced confidence in authority figures who really should be nowhere near authority. The characterizations, the absurdism. Father Ted was strictly speaking Irish, not British, but I think it's loved around the world precisely because of its affectionate portrayal of so much of the wealth of things to laugh about in Irish culture.
What it is, it's that actor. Who? You know, your man from One Foot in the Grave, the I don't believe it, man. Oh, wow. God, that's amazing. Look at him there. Do you know what he'd love? Love it if somebody came up to him and said his catchphrase. I'd say no one ever does that to him. He'd think you're hilarious. I don't believe it. Well, what did he say? Did he laugh? No, not really.
David Walliams and Matt Lucas, before Little Britain, did something that was really funny called Rock Profiles, where they played all sorts of famous rock stars and characters interviewed. They both played all of them. Matt Lucas's Shirley Bassey and David Williams as Tom Jones were wonderful, interviewed in a mockumentary style by Jamie Theakston. I have to give huge praise and recommendation for Stella Street, which ran from 97 to 2001, and it's written and created by Phil Cornwell, John Sessions and Ronnie Ancona. It was truly one of the funniest, most absurd, silly actors playing all kinds of different celebrities living in their retirement on a typical suburban British street. The Mick Jagger character running the local corner shop, the Michael Caine getting into arguments and fights, the David Bowie, all of these characters were so well done. They were stupid and funny, and I really recommend anyone watches that. Please watch it. It's irreverent but affectionate, which I think is what so much British humour does.
Here it is, Mick and Keith's corner shop in Leafy Surbiton.
Here, Keith, have you seen the date on these marshmallows? They are well past their sell-by, they're getting old.
Then they're like us, man, aren't they?
Here, I could do without your stupid jokes.
I said to Keith one day, grocery is where it's at, because I've always had this ambition, because my Uncle Stanley used to run like a hardware store.
The Thick of It, Armando Iannucci, which helped to write Alan Partridge, went on to write The Thick of It. And The Thick of It was a political, satirical, fly-on-the-wall drama which aimed to recreate the madness, the chaos, the panic at the heart of politics in the UK at the turn of the century. And it really captured that, particularly the Blair era, whose culture of obsession with media perception and framing of arguments and selling half-truths or untruths, that culture hasn't necessarily gone away, but it's been so accurately identified and mocked by The Thick of It and similar comedies that British people are so aware of it now as a comic trope. The Office was the turn of the century, and it was the peak of the fly-on-the-wall mockumentary concept, where you have just an ordinary, very boring environment, but they are being followed by a camera crew, and they want to be famous for the sake of it, particularly David Brent, played by Ricky Gervais. I think we all grew up with that. We all had a sense of the revolutionary aspect of that programme, and it lives with us today in impressions and performances and writing styles, particularly the mockumentary concept where the camera appears to be following rather than at the centre of the action. I can't talk about comic influences without mentioning Bo Selector from the early 2000s, Sacha Baron Cohen, particularly Borat, and Peter Serafinowicz, who seemingly single-handedly is a workshop for mad, interesting insights and characters and satire. All of them inspired me with the fact that you can simply do what entertains you in your brain, translate it to a performance, and come out with the most utterly off-the-wall, crazy, interesting personalities, representations, jokes, forms of entertainment. I think that's what really appeals and what parallels with artists like Reeves and Mortimer and all these other performers who allowed their eccentricities to speak and gave themselves the space and the permission to be weird and odd and themselves. All of the eccentric, silly, crazy thoughts that go through your head are allowed to be said and can be appreciated, because that's what comedy is. It's an insight which is so true it makes you laugh. What are your thoughts? Are there shows that I've not mentioned that you think deserve a shout out? How do you feel comedy has developed in this country? Well, thank you for listening, ladies and gents, and I hope to have you subscribe to my SoundCloud. Also follow me on YouTube, on my YouTube channel with all my sketches and writing, Matthew Houlihan. Thank you, and goodbye.